Well, if Henry Grattan was the father of the Irish constitutional nationalist tradition in the 18th century, then the father of the revolutionary tradition was another Trinity graduate, a man called Theobald Wolfe. And Wolfe is seen as the father of modern Irish republicanism. He is, I suppose, the inspiration for so many of the revolutionary figures who followed in his footsteps. Even though, in a sense, he didn't come out with anything radically new in the late 18th century, it was more that I suppose he channeled a lot of the ideas that were going around, ideas inspired by the American Revolution and then by the French Revolution, and he gave them practical expression. He also did it in his brilliant writings. He was one of the most readable of the Irish writers of the 18th century. You could read him today and think it had just been written yesterday. It had such immediacy about it. It was written in such a vibrant and brilliant style. And in a way, he helped popularise a lot of ideas. Crucially, ideas about why Ireland should be an independent, separate country, and also ideas about why the Catholics could be trusted. Because up until then, there were all of these divisions between Catholics, Protestants, and dissenters. The dissenters were the Presbyterians, all at each other's throats. And Tone looked at what had happened in France, and he, in this great publication called An Argument on Behalf of the Catholics in Ireland, published in 1791, which became the great bestseller of the 1790s in Ireland, he argued that in Ireland we should substitute the name of Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter for the common united name of Irishman. And he helped form an organisation, gave them a name, the United Irishmen, that would really put aside all of these religious distinctions and that they would work together as Irishmen and work to create an Irish Republic. And this idea of Irish republicanism was different from what Grattan and the others were talking about. This was a rejection of the notion of an Irish Parliament that was still linked to the British Crown, still part of the British Empire. This was talking about separatism. And Wolfe later claimed that he had been a separatist all his life. Well, that wasn't true. Certainly in 1781, he had wanted to leave college, to leave Trinity, to go off and join the British Army and fight against the American colonists. His mother didn't give him permission. She didn't allow him, and so he was forced to carry on. In 1788, he wrote to the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, asking to be put in charge of a military colony in the South Sea Islands in what is now Hawaii. And that as in command of this garrison, he would actually launch attacks on Spanish ships bringing treasure from South America. So in the 1780s, Wolfe was a man looking for a role in life, looking for adventure. But influenced by what was going on around him, he became a revolutionary, a republican, a separatist, and he became then the inspiration for so much of the radical activity of the 1790s. Sean O'Faolain, the great Irish writer, writing in 1937, said that if Tone did not in his lifetime achieve much, he started much. Without him, republicanism in Ireland would virtually have no tradition. So, who was Wolfe? Well, he was born in Dublin in 1763. He went to school here in Dublin. Apparently he was not a very good schoolboy. He spent most of his time, in his own phrase, mitching. That's a popular Dublin phrase for not attending school, for sneaking off and going to play. He went to the beach a lot. He went in messing around in town. He carried through the same habits pretty much when he entered Trinity College. He would do nothing, no study all during the year, and then he would cram extensively for all his exams. And when he didn't come first in the class, he would then write bitterly about it years later, saying, "Oh, I was cheated out of that. The examiner didn't like me." Trinity was a great place for social entertainments in those days. There were masked balls, there were all-night balls, and also the students would go out of their way to visit other balls. There's a story of a man who became a lawyer. He was a Trinity student called Peter Burrows, later defended Robert Emmet. He once walked 40 miles to an all-night ball in Portarlington and then danced the whole night and then walked back to Trinity the next day. Thomas Gould, who later became an MP and opposed the Act of Union in 1800, he was so rich, he spent £10,000. So in today's money, that's the equivalent of a few £100,000 on entertainments during one single year in Trinity. So these were lavish times, these were decadent times, and Wolfe got in trouble. Because I mentioned before about how popular duels were in Ireland. Well, one of Tone's friends decided to fight a duel, one of his fellow students, and each duelist had a second, a man who would help load the pistols and arrange the details. And Tone acted as a second for a duel while he was at Trinity. And his friend killed his opponent dead. And there was a huge inquiry into Trinity. And they considered expelling him, the fact that he had got caught up in this duel. But instead they suspended him for a year. So he had a year out of college. And during that year, his family got him a job as the tutor to the children of a member of the Irish Parliament, the children of a man called Richard Martin, who was a brilliant duelist himself, ironically enough, but he also loved animals, and he later founded the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Society in Britain, and became a great person for defending the rights of animals in Britain. Now, he didn't mind about shooting people dead, but he would get very annoyed if you mistreated an animal. Well, Wolfe Tone was the tutor to his children while he was away at Parliament. And while he was there, he got involved in all kinds of entertainments, putting on plays with the family and with Richard Martin's wife, a woman called Eliza. And while he was there, he fell madly in love with her. And he thought, I should run off with her. We should elope. We should escape. Her husband doesn't treat her well. And they starred in a production together of a play where Eliza played the character of Matilda, and he loved her in that role. She was Matilda to him. But he didn't do anything. And the year passed, and he went back to Dublin and finished his studies at Trinity. And a couple of years after that, Eliza did run off, but she ran off with someone else. She ran off with a merchant. And Wolfe Tone was furious. He said, I should have made my move. She would have gone for it. I thought she was such a pure creature. I didn't think she'd be interested in me. I should have made my move, and I might have been able to have an affair with her. And so he made a vow he would never pass up on an opportunity ever again. So he came back to Trinity. He was studying there. And while he was walking down Grafton Street, he saw in the window of a coffee shop someone that he liked. And he asked his friend, who's that? And they said, well, that's Martha Witherington. You know, her brother is in your class, but you don't like him. And Tone thought, yeah, okay, I better start being friendly to him so I can get to know the sister. And so he began hanging out with the older brother. And the older brother played a musical instrument, the viola, and Tone played a musical instrument, the violin. So Tone called round to the house one day and he said, look, you play an instrument, I play an instrument, we should pretty much hang out together, and, you know, we could maybe start a string quartet or something. And he used that as a way of hanging around at the house, chatting up the younger daughter, the younger sister, Martha, and he eloped with her. And they went off and they got married. And here's something that I'm afraid always shocks my students whenever I tell them. He persuaded her to change her first name. And he changed her name from Martha to Matilda. And people are always shocked about that because it reminded him of Eliza Martin, the woman he hadn't had the affair with, but who he'd been in love with. And I don't know how he convinced Martha to change her name, what story he spun her. But I think it gives you an example of just how persuasive and charismatic Tone was. And we'll see that when he was trying to persuade the French to launch an invasion into Ireland. He was able to use the same kinds of skills when he was talking to them. So he married Martha. She changed her name to Matilda, and he went off to London to practice as a lawyer. He mentions in his own diaries, which poor Matilda had to edit and publish after his death. He talked about chasing other women while he was over there. He said, English men neglect their wives, and I was able to profit from that. So he had a bit of a roguish lifestyle when he was in London, and then came back to practice as a lawyer in Ireland. But he admitted himself that he was the worst lawyer who ever practiced in the Four Courts, the large area where all the lawyers practiced in Dublin. He didn't understand the law. He didn't care about the law. He wanted to become a politician. He wanted to become a military man, wrote to Pitt. Pitt never answered the letter. So he became a spin doctor, effectively, for the Irish Whigs, writing pamphlets for them. And as time went on, influenced by the French Revolution, he became more radical. He became friends with a man called Thomas Russell. They met in the gallery of the House of Commons. They had a furious argument. Then they went off and they got drunk. A lifelong friendship was formed. And he began thinking about how to separate Ireland, how to unite the Irish people. And as I say then, helped found this group. It was founded in Dublin and also in Belfast, the United Irishmen. And the United Irishmen early on in 1791, they were just like any other group that was in Ireland at that time. Ireland had loads of groups. It had societies for the violin debating societies, cockfighting clubs, horse racing clubs. It was a country that loved clubs and societies. So this one in its early years was really just a debating society where people met to discuss radical ideas. But as it became more radical, it was declared illegal. And from 1794-95 on, it was an illegal organisation. And if you were joining it, that was a crime punishable by, well, you could be arrested and sent to jail. And if you administered the oath that would encourage people to join it, well, that was a crime punishable by death. So it started off as just a forum for people to come and exchange ideas. It ended up being an illegal organisation which actively plotted to separate Ireland from Britain. And Tone, well, he became a figure who the British government began to keep an eye on. They began to monitor his movements, and he was arrested in 1794, but he did a deal with the government. He said that he would leave the country and go to America. And himself and his family, they went to America, but I'm afraid to say he hated America. He was swindled out of a land deal in Philadelphia, and that turned him against the Americans. He later wrote in his memoirs that he'd rather see his daughter dead than married to an American. And when Matilda edited these journals for publication in America in 1826, that was one of the passages that she left out, quite wisely. And he turned against America. But while he was over there, he began meeting with the French ministers, and he began telling them, well, look, if you send a military force over to Ireland, we can help. We can help join in on that. The Catholics will rise up. Our supporters will rise up. We can have a revolution. And the French were a bit suspicious of him. They thought, well, maybe this is an agent provocateur. Maybe he's a British spy. And they weren't so sure. So he decided to leave America and go to France. And while he was there then in 1795, he began working on plans for a French invasion. He began working on this idea that you would rise the Irish up in this rebellion. And he managed to persuade the French that this could work. Because remember, the French were at war with Britain. And the great advantage that the French had was their army. Their army could beat any other army. The great advantage that the British had was the Royal Navy. They could stop any fleet of ships landing. And so what the French had to do was that they had to get an army to either land in Britain or land in Ireland. And the Navy was meanwhile blockading the ports and preventing it. And that was the big gamble that the French came up with in 1796. We will lead an invasion force. We won't go to Britain. We'll go to Ireland. And then if we manage to take over in Ireland, it'll be very easy to cross over then the narrow Irish Channel, and then Britain will fall. This will knock Britain out of the war. And so they decided to confuse all of the British spies that were hanging around in the French ports. They began publishing manifestos in Portuguese and left a few of them behind for the British spies to find. So that the British reported back, the French are planning something. There's a lot of activity. They're preparing their ships for an invasion. They're going to Portugal. And so a lot of the ships began to move that way. But the big problem that the French faced is how could they get their ships out in the summer? It was not going to happen. The British would see what was going on and they destroyed the ships at sea. And also the French didn't really have as good a navy. They never traditionally had as good a navy. But also following the French Revolution, they'd executed a lot of the naval officers because they were from the aristocracy. And so even the admirals that they did have were people who weren't trusted or people who didn't have much naval experience. And so they decided that for this great gamble of an invasion of Ireland, they would have to do it not in the summer when they could sail in clear sunlight. They would be very easily find where the Irish harbour was. They would have to do this in the middle of winter. It seems risky. It seemed crazy, it seemed suicidal, but that was the only chance they had of avoiding the British blockade. And that was why, in December 1796, they embarked on the greatest gamble in French history, and for Ireland, the invasion that, if it succeeded, would knock Britain out of the war and create the Irish Republic that Theobald Wolfe Tone wanted.